Ray, it's good to have you coming on the podcast today. I have long heard of your name, and it's certainly in my family. We hail from DeRidder, so just 33 miles or so up the road from you. But it's great to have you on. How are you doing this morning?
Feeling good. For 99, that is.
Speaking of those origins, Brother Hyatt, talk about your origins in that part of Louisiana. Do you come from DeQuincy, or do you come from other places and you ended
Yes,
up in DeQuincy?
I was born and reared here. We were back, it was in the early part of the Great Depression. We lived out in the country, kind of on a little farm, raised our own pigs and cows and crops. My father and his brothers owned a little grocery store in town, and it was fairly hard times, but we managed pretty well because of our little farm, and it was productive, and we worked at it and grew gardens and smoked hams and killed hogs and made it pretty good through the Depression. And then I grew up and later finished high school here in DeQuincy. And as soon as possible as I could get my mother to sign, well, I joined the Navy. That was World War II was beginning and going on. And then the next 2.5 years I spent here in the States and overseas, mostly in islands, Guam particularly. And later, after that, I came back, went to college, and, and I have been living in DeQuincy most of my life, practically all of my life.
hmm Okay. Now, for people who aren't familiar with DeQuincy, Louisiana, and they may never come there, they may want to stop by on their way to, going across the country or something like that. How would you sum up DeQuincy in your own words?
It's a small little town, about 4,000 residents. We're near Lake Charles. That's where we go mainly to get our clothing and so the bigger stores. But it's a little small country town. We were in the very heart of the great pine tree belt when they first started cutting out the virgin pines. And after they cleared the whole country of these virgin pines, well, there's nothing but stumps left. And then they figure out a use for that. So they built some plants, and we had railroad shops here and things that sustained us all these years. And a little country town still kind of struggling along.
Hmm. I have passed through DeQuincy many times going to visit family in DeRidder. And I always remember going over the railroad tracks and meandering down. And there was a road. I can't remember if it's 12 or 26. I get them backwards, but you take a left and that takes you to DeRidder's. That's all I remember. But,
Right.
uh, so that area, I mean, what are some of your memories growing up in that area? Things that maybe you recall from your childhood that stick with you to this day?
Well, we went to school, and one thing I remember that was unique to this area was during the day of the school, uh, you would hear periodically a large explosion, boom, way off in the distance. And what it was people using dynamite to blow out these stumps out of the ground, to pick them up, to carry them to a plant that utilized them. They made things out of this rock resin and all of that. I remember that. I remember that early on in school, most all the boys all summer and spring and fall went barefooted. We finally put on some shoes in the dead of winter, but it was pretty rare. I remember people, particularly during the Depression, how people would come through on trains hungry, and they would go around town knocking on doors, asking if they could work for a meal or something like that. I remember that distinctly. They would come to my father's grocery store and sit on the front porch when I'd ride with him on the way to school, and they'd be waiting to see, and they always, Dad and them gave them out a little sandwich. That's about all they could afford to give them. But it was hard times for so many people. We've made it pretty good because we lived on a farm and things kind of worked out for us. But it was hard times.
I've heard stories my grandmother's told me, and she talked about her father, Ramsey Neely. I know you knew him, and his daughter Loretta is my grandmother. So she talked a lot about growing up and during that time. And one morning in particular, they didn't have anything to eat. And so it was like, what are we going to eat today? So my great grandfather went out there with a shotgun, and it was some snow on the ground, happened to be some blackbirds. Well, he harvested some blackbirds and they ate blackbird. And, for us in 2025, that's hard to imagine, but that was reality back then.
Yeah, it was pretty hard times. People helped each other. Uh, Hobos would get off the train and walk through town knocking on doors. Can I do anything for a meal? And of course, the meanness wasn't as prevalent back then as it is now. And we weren't afraid of these people. And it was all right for them to knock, and sometimes we'd give them a sandwich, whatever we could. That particularly was true in town. We got a little living out in the country pretty much. We didn't encounter it as much, but it was hard times.
Somewhere along the way, you became a preacher, but what led to you becoming a preacher? Where did faith?
All right, my mother and her sister were the first two Christians here in DeQuincy that we knew of. They were baptized. Their husband, who went to the denomination, didn't want to really be involved with them. So there was no church here, and so they started meeting in their home. That was long ago, and I began to want to insist on going with them. I mean, staying there with them rather than going with my father. And we had a little yeah about that, but we got through it. But in time, there was another couple moved here. And so they began to meet in various places, the City Hall, American Legion Hall, in their homes. And eventually got some more. And then eventually, we finally built a little church house when I was about 12 years old. Shortly thereafter, we had a meeting in that little church house, and I was baptized when I was 12 years old. And they used me as best they could to read a little bit. I didn't have any experience at all, but they were patient with me and tried to encourage me. And they did. Later, when I graduated from high school, I was a Christian for a number of years. And then when I graduated from high school, I wanted to go into the Navy. And finally, Mother signed for me, and I could. So I got into the Navy. And then in the Navy, I fell away. I got into bad stuff that I wasn't used to in this little town. Fell away for a while. I come back home, and in reality, my conscience hurt me all that time, I think. But when I got back home, I confessed my faults and got myself straight with the Lord. And that's when I really became more interested in teaching and preaching, and they began to utilize me. In fact, when we went to school at Lafayette, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but we were meeting in a Jewish synagogue because there was a church there. We would meet on Sunday. They met on Saturday. We had moved the apparatuses they used there out of the way, and down there they didn't have a preacher, so they utilized me periodically, and I got more interested in it. And then when I come back home, I just kind of gradually fell into it. Down here in Louisiana, the church is not very strong, and a lot of little small congregations, and they can't either afford a preacher or can't find one. And so we have to fill in, many of us, and we did that. In fact, over the years, I began to preach early on in my life because of something that happened. I made a vow to the Lord very early that I would never, ever take a cent or any compensation of any kind for anything that I've done for the Lord or his church. I kept that vow, and I'm happy I did. All my life, I remembered it, and I kept that vow. And so I was able to help a lot of little congregations that couldn't afford a preacher. And there was lots of them in this part of the country. Southeast Texas, Southwest Louisiana just had lots of little congregations. As a matter of fact, I've got a list of the congregations that I've helped preach without compensation all these years. And there's at least 55 of them. And some smaller than others. Lake Charles grew up to be big. The Ritter, first place, another around here, but so many of them were little country towns. And to this day, I still do the same thing. I have preached at congregations that at times we had as many as 500 people, but that's rare. The majority of them is preaching 15 to 20, 25. 10, one time one, just me and one.
Well, you had an audience, so there you go. I was talking to my grandmother yesterday. I told her that I was interviewing you, and she remembered you when she was younger. And I remember stories of both her and my mom, Kathy, too, is my mom. And they said, when we were kids, we would go to gospel meetings that my great-grandfather Ramsey would go to. And there was one, I think the area was called New Lano.
Yes.
And my mom said, the one thing I remember about that, because of course she was a child when she was going to these meetings, was that the song leader would come in on a horse. And she said, ask Ray if he remembers any stories around, about that, because I'm sure he probably would have been in and out of that area as well. Do you remember any of those gospel meetings during that time, I guess in the 50s, 60s?
Yes, I remember a lot of them. In fact, last week, we went to a singing up at Jackson Chapel Church of Christ. That's right there at Milano, up there by Leesville.
Yes.
Sadly, the Leesville church has closed up. The church is not strong, as I said, down in this part of Louisiana. Heavy Catholic influence immediately to the south of us, but it's not very strong. But we've had a number of little congregations play out, close up, and that's sad. And of course, I try to help as many of them as I can. For example, a church in the Sulphur, I helped establish that. And a man came and helped me, and we got it going. And then he dropped out, and I kept preaching for him till they could get a preacher. And in time, they became a congregation of about 300, which is very good in this part of Louisiana. But over the years, other things happened, and today there's about 15 to 18 go to that congregation. I still help them preach. Some, and they're trying to struggle along and survive, but that's true of lots of little congregations. I can name 6 or 8 on my hand right around here, fairly close, that have closed their doors. That's sad. I don't know what the real answer is to it. We do the very best we can. We preach the gospel the best we can. And it's been a great pleasure to me to be able to help small congregations and all over here in Southeast Texas, just lots of them out in the country that you don't even never hear from. And they have anywhere from 10 to 50 people, and sometimes they can afford a preacher, sometimes they can't. Mm-hmm. And they can't, well, they just have to do by themselves. And so we've learned to be kind of self-service when it comes to preaching and teaching out here in this part of Louisiana.
Right. I know a good friend of mine at church, my friend Wayne Taylor. He and I've done the media ministry at our church over here in Pasadena for a long time. I no longer am able to do it. I attend another church now, but he still does, and he's sent recordings. Some small churches, remote churches, will ask for video recording because we stream our services as well, and he'll dutifully print out, render and process DVDs to send to these small churches. And he may never hear a word back from them. He don't even know if they're getting them or not, but he sends them. He's doing what he's supposed to do and just supporting these little churches like you talk about.
That's a good work. And of course, we need a lot more of that. And I'm not very productive when it comes to all these newfangled ways of doing things, but it's good, and I'm glad that people are able to do it and get help these little congregations.
Mm-hmm. So, Ray, if you weren't the paid preacher, how did you make it? And what was your career? How did you feed yourself?
I went to school at Lafayette. They have a good university there. Graduated as a math science teacher, but I did not take a job teaching math science because I had another better offer from a man that was manufacturing rice dryers and things. And I went to work for him for a couple of years, and then I joined my brother, and we got into the grocery business, and we was into the grocery business for another 5 years till I finally got out of that and semi-retired. And then I went to work for the city as a city planner in DeQuincy here for another 10 years after I thought I was retiring. And then after that, finally, I retired a few years ago. But I still try to help these little congregations around here in an area within 50 miles around here. And a lot of them just struggle along and need help. And they'll call me for a little meeting when they, can't afford to hire a preacher to come in there and do that. And I'm happy to do that.
Mm-hmm.
The Lord has blessed me with a good living all my life, a good family, Christians, all of them, and blessed me financially so I can be independent. I don't have to be concerned about that. And that's a blessing. And of course, I'll give it all the credit to the Lord Jesus Christ. But it allows me to do that without any problems. I served here as an elder for about 39 years at this town congregation. And then I retired from that because we had some other good elders, and so they wouldn't miss me, and so I could give a little more time to my preaching around the country.
Okay. Let's talk about preaching style for a minute. I know growing up, and I'm 50, so I mean, you've got almost 50 years on me, Brother Hyatt, but I've experienced the change in various Church of Christ over the years. When I was a kid, I went to Bobo and Roberts, which had that kind of small town style. It had its own unique style to it. I didn't know anything other than that until we moved over here near the Houston area, which we went to various Churches of Christ, and there were slightly different. Some would be more conservative, more moderate, maybe liberal. How would you sum up your own style, if I were to show up at the DeQuincy Church of Christ this weekend, what might I experience? And how has that changed for you over the years as you developed as a preacher?
For the most part, the small congregations in this area, and that's what I primarily preach for. I would go occasionally to lecture. In fact, I preached a lot for lecturers over the years. Pretty big congregation, and I've preached a good bit for the river in years past. But generally, the congregations I preach for are small rural congregations. They are not too involved with new, and they stay give me the old times and the old ways, the old days, the kind of state of that. They are not bothered too much by modern changes that some are good, some are bad. You understand?
Hmm.
They do things a lot in different ways, but for the most part, they still kind of old fashioned. And of course, that kind of suits me. I'm kind of old fashioned too. But not that I have anything against the modern ways of doing things. It's good. But I just kind of, I guess I've been brought up too long the other way. So I'm not as much into all of this newer communication systems than so many people know so much about it more
Hmm.
than I.
Okay. The term fire and brimstone preacher was very synonymous with the Church of Christ, certainly when I was growing up. What do you think about that? Was that a fair assessment of the style going back 40, 30, 40, 50 years and beyond? Or is that not a fair assessment?
That was a very much a good description of the old time preachers. I can remember Boxwood, a little church out here from the Quincy. Been there for longer. It was there when I was a very small child. That's where they would bring me to church when I go out to see my grandmother lived out there. Hard, pretty tough preaching. It was a little congregation. I remember the women would sit on one side and all the men on the other. See, that's how far back in the woods they were. When they gave their contribution, that was after the Lord's Supper, each man, they'd sing a song, and each man would get up one by one and walk down the aisle and lay it on the table. It was generally a few nickels or pennies because it was during the Depression. One by one, and that'd take 15 or 20 minutes. We'd sing all that time while each man, not the women, just the men, walked, lay down on them. So, that was all kind of old timey things, not wrong in themselves, but just different, and it's the old fashioned way of doing it. It took them a while to grow out of that. Today, I still go and preach for that little church. Been there a long time, and they do things different now. And but I can remember the old days, and the women wore the little bonnets
Hmm.
and so on and so forth. And that used all we had was the funeral home fans to cool ourselves. And then, of course, we were baptized down in the little creek right behind the church.
Hmm. Okay. Now you
But
talk,
hey, that's just
yeah.
nowadays. The services are vastly different as far as all the newfangled stuff that we do, and that's good.
Hmm.
That's it should be.
Okay. Now you talked earlier about being baptized at 12 years old. Where were you baptized at?
Well, at that time, when we built the first little church building, we did not have the money. We believe you me, we struggled to get it built. We've done most of the work ourselves, but we did not have room to put money to put a baptistry in there. And so they were still taking them to the creek when I was baptized. I was taken out. It's interesting. If we had a meeting and it was at night, we'd go right after that meeting. We wouldn't wait till the next day. We'd take them right that night to the creek. So I responded during the meeting. They took me down the Beckwith Creek, and I remember they drove up and parked the car so the light shone down on the creek. That was our light. See, there was no lights out there. It was a place where we swam. And then they took me down, and on the way down there, they had to kick a couple of moccasins out of the way down there. And they baptized me. All right, it wasn't too long after that we got a baptistry in the little building and was able to do better. But I remember that distinctly because they had to kick the moccasins out of the way. But we made it fine and had no problem. And so that was common back in those days. Boxwood, this little church out here in the country that I still go to, they baptized in a little creek right down behind the building for years and years. Of course, now they have a baptistry and so on and so forth.
Hmm. Hmm. Do you remember the name of the creek you were baptized in?
Do what?
Do you remember the name of the creek you were
Yes, it's
baptized
Beckwith Creek.
in?
It's still
Beckwith
there
Creek.
today. Beckwood Creek. It's about 4 miles from DeQuincy.
Okay. Okay. Let me ask you about ages as it relates to being becoming a Christian, being baptized. Some people will say you need to be older. Some people say, well, I was baptized at 4, 5, 6 years old, and I've always kind of raised a couple of eyebrows at that age. But what do you think is the right age? Is there a right age, or is it just when you feel you're ready?
A person has to know and be able to believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Be aware of the fact that he has sinned against God, repent of those sins, and then he may be a candidate for baptism. Those things have to be there. It depends on how soon a person can do that. I can't give you a date. No, we look around 11, 12, 13 years old on there. I was baptized when I was 12. I knew what I was doing. I understood that very carefully. And I never questioned my baptism. I was sincere about it. Later, when I fell away and I had to come back, knew what I had to do, and I was sincere about it, and I never have questioned it. I believe God forgave me because I understood that. Have you got a minute? Let me tell you a little story.
Sure.
I was holding a meeting one time over in South Texas. I forgot where it was. And I preached all week, and nobody had responded. I was kind of a little discouraged. But the last night, one little girl, she was maybe 10, 11. I don't believe she was 12, came down the aisle. Well, pretty soon her mother came up there with her. And I asked her mother, I said, you confident she knows what she's doing? She said, the little girl told me she wanted to be baptized. And I was apprehensive. I wanted her to be able to know what she's doing to the best of my ability. And so I talked to her mother, and her mother said, yes, she's been talking about this, and she knows she knows it's what the Bible teaches. She said, I want you to baptize her. I said, fine. So I baptized, went home. And some people shortly thereafter say, well, how was your meeting over so-and-so? That wasn't much to it, not much done. One little old girl came up, that was all. I kind of brushed it off. 15 years later, I was holding a meeting in Vidor, Texas. A family came in that I didn't recognize to visit. I didn't pay too much attention, but I said I didn't know the root. A nice looking woman and a man and 3 children. And so after the church, I was telling everybody back because it was this last night. And I was kind of discouraged and didn't have much response. And so after the church, I was telling everybody back because it was this last night. And I was kind of discouraged and didn't have much response. But on the way out, there was that couple and their 3 little children were still waiting for me. Got there and I said, well, glad you came. Where are y'all from? And they told me, and they said, you don't know who we are. I said, no, ma'am, I don't. And she said, well, that woman, good-looking Christian woman, fine family, you baptized me 15 years ago at such and such. You remember? I said, yes. I didn't think it amounted to much, but yet we never know.
That's true. You never know the impact you're going to have on someone's life, certainly in your line of work in regards to being a preacher. And, you've mentioned a couple of times that when you go to some of the church meetings, that maybe one doesn't seem as eventful as another. Maybe, that maybe you didn't have anyone that wanted to come up and either become a Christian or not. How do you gauge whether or not you've had a successful sermon when you're preaching?
I gauge it by the fact that, well, a preacher can tell when an audience is listening and absorbing a sermon. If you preach long enough or you public speaking of any time, you can tell. You can understand that. You can feel an empathy, believe you me, with your audience, and you know when you're getting through to them. And then I just say, Lord, help me here to do the best I can. And then I just go ahead and leave it with him, because I'm trying to preach his gospel to the best I can. And when I do that, I'm satisfied. And if they come down good, if they don't, well, I say, Lord, you just had other ideas here. And so that's all I can do. Mm-hmm. But I never get discouraged. The great deal of the time, I don't get receptions when I preach. And a preacher has to get used to that. I only know one preacher in my life that could actually get them down better than anybody else I ever knew, get them to respond. Brother Murphy Phillips, he's no longer here with us. He preached in this area a long time. He had some shortcomings, but let me tell you, he had the ability to get them better than any other preacher I've ever seen.
That's interesting.
I wish I had that ability.
What do
you are anxious for people to respond to the gospel. That's why you're preaching.
Right. What do you attribute to his success?
I can't put my finger on it. He had good sermons. He was a good, powerful speaker. I do not know. Let me tell you a true story. We were having a meeting in Lake Charles. We'd hired a big preacher. He came in and preached all week. Didn't have one response. He was really a good preacher. Well known. At the end of the last meeting, Friday night, they sung the invitation song. Nobody came. 0 for the whole week. And then our old preacher got up and said, I'm not quite satisfied with this. Let's sing one more verse of one more song. And he got Just As I Am. Mm-hmm. And he sung it. And he offered the invitation, and 9 people came down. Now, this was a fine preacher we had. Technically, I think he's probably a better preacher than the one we had. But I don't know, I can't exactly put my finger on it, but I have seen that happen. Mm-hmm. I wish I had more of that. So whatever it was, to get people to respond to the gospel. We do the best we can with what we got.
I want to ask you something that I've experienced it growing up in the Church of Christ. And I've visited with friends, other churches. With these interviews, I interview people outside the Church of Christ and maybe in other faiths because I want to get to know them as well. And I know one thing that I've experienced, at least in Texas, where I've spent most of my life, is we tend to refer to, when we talk about a person's start in their faith, it's, when were you baptized? When did you get baptized? It's not usually, when did you become a Christian? When did you profess your faith? It seems there's a lot of tie into the act of baptism. Do you think that's good, or do you think that's putting the emphasis on part of the process for sure, but not the totality of it?
You are absolutely right. Of course, we get in the habit of talking about baptizing people as if that's the whole operation. And of course, it isn't. The key operation is beginning to get their interest and make them listen and learn to believe. And then that will lead to the rest of it.
Right.
But we should, if we go to emphasize something, we better emphasize faith. That's where we better start emphasizing. But yes, we do tend to talk like that. And we should. We should talk about your conversion, which encompasses all of it. Right. I concur with you with that. But we just get in the habit of talking about baptizing them.
Yeah. Do you think, Well, let me ask you it this way. How many people do you think, when you look out in the audience, the various pews that you've taught out over the years, there are a lot of people you see show up there week after week after week. But we know, you get to know them. Maybe they're fooling themselves. Maybe they're not the believer they thought they were. Maybe they're not really even Christians. What do you think about that when you look out there, and how can you as a preacher maybe spot and maybe have concerns over a person that you see going through the motions, but maybe you know a little bit about them, or maybe just something's not right, and maybe you want to go up to them and say, hey, let's talk about this. Are you sure you're right in your faith? What do you think about that?
I'm going to tell you another quick story that'll kind of answer your question. I was going to Lake Charles. Murphy Phillips was preaching there. There was a town, Sulphur, about 10, 15 miles away. They had a number of Christians there, about a dozen, coming into Lake Charles, where I was living at that time. Our preacher said, you know, Sulphur needs a church. He said, Ray, I'll go over there and hold a meeting. Dozen coming over here. If when I get through, then we'll start a church, but you've got to preach, because I'm preaching over here. He said, I'll go hold a meeting and we'll get this thing started and set up and get this going if you'll preach. I said, okay, I'll preach. I was living in Lake Charles, but I drive silver. It wasn't far. Okay. We went over there. He, sure enough, he baptized a few. We started with them, talked them into it. They had a little building, found one. We started church, and I started preaching. I preached over there for 2 or 3 years. We got it built up enough where we can hire a preacher. Okay. We were the luckiest in the world. We hired a guy from North Louisiana, never heard of. Come down there and preach, and he was a tolerably good preacher. Not the best I've ever heard by a long shot, but pretty good. But he had a precious thing that is so rare amongst preachers, teachers, Christians. He loved people and he loved to help. He moved to town. Now, this is a little church of 20. In 2 years, he had it up to 300 and something. Now, in Louisiana, that's a miracle. You understand? Mm-hmm. It's tough down here in this Catholic part that we're in. That part all down there, that's pretty heavily Catholic, so on and so forth. It's pretty tough. But anyway, 2 years, he had it up to 300. And I watched what he was doing. He was a good preacher, but not that good. It wasn't his preaching. It was what he was doing every day. He would get up out there. He lived in a kind of a poorer area of the city, and he'd go help people or talk to them and bring them and take this stuff to constantly. Everybody loved it. And they had just come to church. And it worked. I've never seen it work better in my life anywhere. Never have. I don't care how powerful a preacher or great a preacher or orator is. If he doesn't have that empathy for somebody lost and wants to help people, he won't be successful.
Mm-hmm. That reminds me of my great uncle, Ernie Duhan. I think you know Ernie, and my Aunt Angie. When he was alive over at Bilbo and Roberts, he was always helping out and, doing different things. He'd go and take communion to people in the nursing home and the hospital. He did it all the time. He put together a little, I didn't even know this until recently. I'd read his obituary. He passed away back in 2017. You officiated his service. And he had posted a little newsletter, I guess, every week.
Who was that you were talking about?
Ernie Duhan.
Oh, yes. I knew Ernie well, Ernie well. He worked out, in fact, he came to DeQuincy for a year or two, but then he, I think, moved up to the river. I knew him well. Mm-hmm. Great guy. Yeah. Always helping somebody.
Yes. And there was stuff in that obituary I didn't even know about him. And I just thought, that's what you just said about that other preacher. It's not necessarily your oratory skills, it's your empathy. It's people connect to you? Do they see you out there doing what you say you believe?
That's exactly it.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. When you're talking to maybe up and coming preachers, what advice do you give to the person that comes to you and says, "Brother Hyde, I think I'm interested in taking the gospel to the masses," as the Great Commission says? What's your advice to them?
Well, I don't have much advice to them than just stay with the Bible and of course try to become friends and reach out and help people. You help them sometimes with physical things that leads to spiritual things so many times. They're hungry, give them something to eat, and maybe then you can feed them some spiritual food. But I'm not much of a, I'm not, I can't, I don't know much about, because I haven't been that successful in my ministry. I've done the best I can, but I wish I could have been much more successful, of course. We're never satisfied with what we're doing.
Hmm. How many years have you been preaching now?
Well, I started preaching, oh, that is, wait a minute. They got me doing little things, reading scriptures when I was first baptized, 12. Remember, I fell off when
Hmm.
I on the way when I got in service for a couple of years. And then when I come back, I got pretty much back into it fairly quickly, just filling in, teaching classes, doing what I could. I wasn't really thinking about it. And that's kind of, then I went down here where they didn't have a preacher at the Lafayette in school. And so they got me teaching Sunday morning class and then preaching a little bit and so on and so forth. And it just kind of grew naturally. And I had said like way back there, I had made a vow when I was 12, and that I would never take nothing. I didn't want anything, so that give them an out too. They didn't have anybody to pay anybody, so good that I fit the bill good.
Hmm. Hmm.
And never regretted that for a second.
Okay. All the years that you've been preaching, I know to go and preach a sermon is one thing, to conduct a funeral is another. And that's a lot of times part and parcel with being a preacher. You're going to get called to do preach every Sunday or every other Sunday or whatever your rotation is. You're going to officiate weddings and you're also going to conduct funerals. How many funerals did you say you've conducted over the years?
I didn't keep record, probably somewhere between 250, 300, somewhere like that.
I ask you that question, that establishes that experience that you've had. And I know out of the couple of hundred or two or 300 funerals that you've done, some of them probably went really well. And you were, relatively speaking, as well as a funeral can go, you probably felt like, okay, I presented what I needed to present. I did a good job. Other times it maybe this response wasn't there. Can you talk about it without mentioning names, of course, an experience at a funeral that you remember that you just thought, oh my goodness, I'm glad that one's over. It didn't go the way I thought it was going to go.
Of course, you have times like that. Uh, Funerals are hard because you want to speak the truth, and at the same time, you want to try to reach out to the family and be kind and courteous to them in every way that you can. They're hard, very hard. Recently, not too long ago, I had to quit preaching funerals. They was knocking me plumb out. I was at too many people that I didn't even know. Uh, and I've worked here for the city of DeQuincy as a city planner for about 10 or 12 years, and both of the mayors, long term, one of them was a long term mayor, the other was a pretty long. They died, and I preached both of their funerals. Now, they weren't members of the Church of Christ, they were members of other places, but I didn't preach their funeral. I preached a pretty good lot of funerals, but funerals are very hard on you. It's not a one time. preaching a sermon, it's just 1 hour. You've got an hour, a few hours of preparation, but then it's over in 1 hour. Funerals last 2 or 3 or 4 days, and then you got to deal way ahead of time with family, where, what, when, how, what, all kind of things. Very hard. That's why I dropped out of that. It was getting too hard on me. I couldn't do it. But funerals, nothing about a funeral is easy. You want to tell the truth, and you don't want to hurt the family, and you have to choose your words like walking on coals very carefully.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, you want to, while you're giving comfort, solace, you want to teach the truth. Always, as a spokesman for the Lord, always, number one, teach the truth. And do it the best and kindest, gentlest way you can, but you got to teach the truth.
Mm-hmm. How do you handle conducting a funeral for a non-believer? Let's say a non-believer contacts you, or their family contacts you and says, "We've heard about you. We would like you to do it."
I have had so much of that, extremely difficult. But you have to tell the truth. There's some good things you can say about anybody, and you're going to bring that up, and you're going to bring what a fine man he was, that you're going to bring he raised beautiful children, and you're going to he done good things, and you're going to do this and that and the other. But you are very careful to say, we know for a fact that he's in heaven today. You're not going to have been there and say that, because you can't with good conscience say that. You can say, and you can tell people, those of us who obey the gospel of the Lord, love the Lord Jesus Christ and follow him, and go to heaven and so on and so forth. But you got to tiptoe through the tulips. Maybe that's a poor way of saying it, but that's about what it amounts to sometimes. Mm-hmm. You don't want to hurt nobody. You're not there to preach a gospel sermon, but you do want to try to hold up Jesus Christ as the Savior of the world in anything that you do.
You talked about falling away as a young man, but then coming back. There's so many people that have that prodigal son sort of story where they knew right, but they took a different path, but something brought them back. What do you, well, there's kind of two parts to this question. The first part is, what brought you back?
I was very naive when I got into the Navy. I didn't know nothing, and hadn't really been exposed too much to the devil and all his wiles. Lived a pretty secluded life out in the country. I run into it a little bit in high school, but not too bad. We was a little country school, and there wasn't really too many bad people there. But when I got to the Navy, my goodness, I was thrown into things that just overwhelmed me. Got to drinking and running and chasing women, and I'd done it all. Just went from bad to worse. All along, I think my conscience was hurting me. I knew better. It was difficult. I was in positions where there was no churches, got stuck on an island out in the Pacific, Guam, waiting on the atomic bombs and all this sort of stuff. It was just bad. And I just, down deep, I probably knew better all the time. But when I come back home, right back into my mother, father, and by then my dad, early he was not a Christian, but he became a Christian then when they over in the church, one of the first elders in Quincy. But anyway, found myself back in that situation as I saw right quick. This was no, I have been wrong, totally wrong, and it's time to be straight right. Come back, and I did. And I made my public confession before the church, and I just laid it all out because I had done it all, confessed it, asked them to pray for me, and I've tried to stay straight ever since. That don't mean I'm perfect, but I try to follow my Lord and try to stay true to Him.
Do you have a verse or a couple of verses that's kind of serves as a guidepost for you in your faith?
No, I can't. I can't say that I do any particular verse. I don't believe I do. I like to read the Bible. I read the Bible. The Lord has blessed me particularly in my old age. I still have my strength to a degree. I don't have any physical problems to amount to anything. But my mind has become sharper, maybe not sharper, I don't know, but I can think clearly. And I lay awake at night. In fact, I'm writing a little book. I don't know if I'll ever finish it, but one of the things that kind of bother me a little bit as I go to church and service is the little attention that we pay to at the remarks made at the Lord's table. And that's a period of 3 or 4 or 5 minutes when probably the attention of the audience is more directed and sensitive than perhaps any other time. And yet people get up there and say a few little something that don't amount to anything. So I've written about 150 what I think is dynamic, good, sharp, to the point, attention-getting remarks at the Lord's table. And I'm going to put it in a little book if I ever get it finished, which I may not. I better hurry up here.
Okay. That's good. I hope
anyway, I think that would be useful for people to read and think, put some thought into it, because at that moment, I think your audience is more attentive than perhaps at any other time during the service. So see, we got our mind right there concentrated on that one thing.
Mm-hmm. Brother Hyatt, a lot of people that I talk to would say the Lord's Supper is the capstone of the service. That's really what the focus is all about. If that's the case, why is it so short?
Well, that may be. There's certainly nothing wrong if you want to extend it any. I don't know. It's custom, I think, just because we've always done it that way. I think, we do a lot of things just because we've always done it that way.
Right. Tradition.
And that may be the reason. I don't know there's any other reason particularly. Anyway, if I write a book, I'll send you one.
I hope you do, and please sign it. Another question that's come up, I wanted to get your opinion on. There's some discussion amongst, when I go and visit some of the local churches around here, that after we take the bread, take the fruit of the vine, then the collection. Some people say separate and apart from the Lord's Supper, and they would say the collection. I've heard others people say it's part of the same thing. We're offering Thanksgiving. Is it the same or is it separate?
The world's going to hell in a handbasket, and here we are sometimes arguing about the most inconsequential things, I think, sometimes.
Right.
People are out there needing to hear the gospel. Don't get too concerned about whether we spend 5 minutes on the offering or 5 minutes on this over here. And you can take the offering up at the first session if you want to. It doesn't. I don't think it's important at all. They're two separate things, just like singing is different from preaching or praying and all like that. And we mix them all up, mix them up most any way you can. The Bible, I don't think it gives us any set directions about exactly how they're to be in order.
Right.
So I think that's things of little consequence, to tell you the truth.
Mm-hmm. It seems like in this area, the part of Houston that I live in, there's a lot of community churches, and those community churches get a lot of attendance, and I've visited a number of them to see what it's all about myself and my own explorations. And it's very casual. It seems like a rock concert to me, which is not my style. I like the traditional hymns. I like a cappella music, but they do get people in the doors.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on that?
There's I tell you, I'm not that well versed about all of them. I'm here in a small area with small little churches. We don't encounter a lot of things that you will encounter in larger cities and bigger churches.
Right.
Have grandchildren going to big congregations all over the country, and they talk to me about all the different things they encounter. So we don't encounter that here in our little churches. We've only got one or two fairly good-sized churches. DeRidder's pretty good. Lake Charles is pretty good. That's about it. And my whole area of concern right here. I don't say concern, but you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
But so many of those things are, many times they don't amount to a hill of beans one way or another. I think we have certain leeway. We can sing 3 songs, 4 songs. I'm not going to split a hair with you. If you want to sing an invitation song first, it suits me all right. You know, these kind of things, just use good judgment. The Lord is not going to, He's not going to get us on nitpicky things. It's going to be the things that count. Do we love Him? Do we love our fellow man? Are we trying to spread the gospel? Will we obey His commands? Big things, not little minor things. I don't think that's my way of thinking about that.
Right.
I going as to many churches as I go to, I see some of them doing a little bit different. I don't see it. It's just a matter of, it's not a matter of law laid down, thou shalt do it this way. It's just a matter of whatever is best for that situation. Most of it don't amount one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
That's my way of thinking about it. I got more things to be concerned about than a lot of these little nitpicky things we're dealing with.
Sure. Everyone wants peace in life, whether they're a person of faith or not. Everyone wants peace. They want satisfaction in their life. What's your prescription to having peace and satisfaction with your faith?
Well, you got to just start off the beginning of the fear of God and keep His commandments. And that's a long way to having it, I think. You'll be satisfied, you'll be happy, you'll be confident, and you'll love your fellow man because of it. And that'll just lead you a happy life. I have tried both ways. I know which is the best way. And my whole life has been good and happy, and the Lord's blessed me every way I turn, and just it's good.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a magic formula except that: obey God and keep His commandments.
Right. Now, you know, some people would say, well, you folks in the Church of Christ are real hung up on works, and it sounds like you're working your way to heaven, doing all the right things. What's your counter argument to that?
After I've done all that I could, we are still unprofitable servants. That's what the Bible teaches us.
Hmm.
After you've done all that you can, you're still unprofitable. After we've done all that we can, I'm still holding on to grace and mercy tight. I ain't going to turn them loose. That's the only way I'm going to make it. It's by the grace and the mercy of God and the forgiveness of sins through Jesus Christ and His precious blood that any of us are going to be saved. Not by works, lest any man should boast here. Although we are His workmanship created unto good works, but it's not by works, lest any man should boast. You got to be careful. Don't get those two mixed up. You got to work, but that don't save you. It's His grace and mercy. So I don't worry too much. People, they want to make a big deal out of salvation, and salvation in itself is fairly simple if you just read the Bible and do what the good Lord says for us to do, and say, give me a little help here, Lord, and believe you me, he will. But he had to give a lot of help for me.
Well, speaking of the simple gospel, how would you summarize the gospel in simplest terms for anyone that may be watching this that's not sure?
Well, the gospel, of course, is the power of God unto salvation. It's simply good news that God loved the world. He so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. That's beyond my comprehension that he would do that. In fact, looking at the world, I'm not sure why he loved it, but it was his creation, just like we love our children, even though a lot of times they get in all kind of things. We still love them. We don't lose that love. And God loved us, and he made a way for us, and he wants us to be with him in heaven, and if we'll just do what he says, we can.
Okay.
Got me down to preaching here.
Well, you're a preacher. I can't have you come on and not do some kind of preaching, Brother Hyatt. What's the most difficult sermon to preach for you?
This what?
What's the most difficult sermon to preach as far as subject matter is concerned?
Well, when you're preaching a sermon of someone who's not a Christian, that's very tiptoey and tough. You got friends, neighbors, family that you don't want to hurt, and you certainly don't want to tell lies. You don't want to. That's the hardest kind of preaching. I don't have no trouble preaching the gospel about most any of the commands that God gave us to do. I don't worry about those. I feel like I can do that solidly. But when you're, I don't like funerals. Yes, you can tell that funerals are tough.
Mm-hmm.
Always, not always. You got Christians that you say good things about them, but so many times you're not sure, and you kind of, it's hard to tiptoe through the tulips on that sometimes.
I hope you have many, many, many years left in your life, and I think you will. But what are you looking forward to most about the hereafter?
Well, I can read about heaven. I know that our picture of heaven is probably so short of what it really is that anyway, it's going to be good.
Mm-hmm.
I'm aware that we can't visualize it. It's beyond our true comprehension. Just we can't understand God completely and all. Mm-hmm. But that's all right. We'll know it then, and we'll know as we've known. He's known. So it'll be just right for everybody that makes it perfect.
Okay. And then the last couple of questions I have for you, Brother Hyatt. One is for a person that's placed their faith in Jesus. They're trying to do what they can to be obedient, but they're still just not sure. That everyone wants that assurance. They want that guaranteed stamp on their forehead. Can one have that peace?
The best remedy for that is when I get the doubt, wondering or lost, I'll just get my Bible and I'll start reading, and I'll get my commentaries, and I'll get tells me where I'm finding scripture, and I'll just start reading the scriptures. And I tell you, just setting myself and reading the scriptures, I get a sense of security, and faith is renewed, and it works. To me, the Word of God is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword. And when you really get down and out, lay hold on it and read it. Read it. Just stop. Read a while. Read the Bible a while. And it revives my faith. Because faith comes by hearing and hearing by the word of God. That's where we get our faith. You get faith gets weak, get to the word.
What's one thing that you think we as Christians can do, especially given all the technology and the changes in our world, to not just preserve the faith, but continue the faith traditions that we have going forward?
Well, I don't know. You get up into things that I'm not really very well uh, able to. I know, for example, larger churches and big metropolitan areas face a lot of different uh, things than a little country church out here in the wildwood faces. There's it's daylight and dark in a way. Most of my life, I have been involved with smaller congregations. And I have been to some degrees, like Charles, they have about 250 there. That's big for us down here, see. And with them, and here in DeQuincy, we have about 60 or 70. It's all we have here in our little church. And that's most of my congregations that I've preached at has been small. Totally different. Lots of different ways there are problems than they'd have in these big city churches. Because I have my grandchildren, they talk to me about these big city churches and so on and so forth. It's different. But it all boils down to we're following the same gospel. The Bible doesn't change for this person or that person here. We all got the same Bible. We might read different parts of it, interpret it a little bit different depending on a lot of things, how you were brought up and everything else. But ultimately, the Word of God is what we'll be judged by and what we have to live by.
And for people who, and we're going to conclude the interview with this question, people who feel like they're believers, they're doing the best they can, but they just don't feel like they're as fruitful as they need to be. What would you recommend to people who want to feel like they're doing?
Number one, read your Bible and go be around solid Christian people.
Mm-hmm.
I can get down and out, and you let me get around a bunch of Christian people that's happy and they're doing good and trying to do good and helping people and going and doing and teaching. First thing you know, it rubs off on me. I believe we can help each other. That's why we're to pray for each other and help each other and lift each other up. And I think that's a good thing. When you get to feeling kind of down and out and feel all alone, hunt you up a Christian man or woman or two or three, and first thing you know, it'll rub off on you. It was very nice of you to even think about me, and I enjoyed doing it very much.